The United States and China attempt to mend ties, but talks get off to a fiery start, each accusing the other of grandstanding and hypocrisy. So, what can the meeting in Alaska achieve? And how will it affect the friends and foes of the superpowers? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mohammed Jamjoom. Alaska is often known as the last frontier in the U.S. The state near the Arctic provided an icy backdrop to a meeting aimed at resetting frosty relations with China. But hopes of a thaw quickly melted away. At the start of the talks, Washington and Beijing's top diplomats traded sharp rebukes for an hour. The exchange highlighted big differences on everything from global security to trade and human rights. Our diplomatic editor James Bays reports from Anchorage.
This is a meeting that will shape future relations between the world's two biggest powers, relations that are currently at a low point.
Good afternoon, and welcome.
Normally, opening remarks at events like these are brief and polite, but the U.S. side went on to list their specific concerns.
In Xinjiang, Hong Kong, Taiwan, cyber attacks on the United States, economic coercion toward our allies.
The Chinese response was long and just as frank. The Foreign Minister Wang Yi said you don't welcome guests with sanctions, a reference to the blacklisting of 24 Chinese and Hong Kong officials in the hours before the meeting. His senior colleague, Politburo member Yang Jiechu, was clearly unhappy.
Well, I think we thought too well of the United States. We thought the U.S. side would follow the necessary diplomatic protocols.
He went on to complain about regime change in the Middle East and the US's own human rights record.
The challenges facing the U.S. in human rights are deep-seated. They did not emerge over the past 4 years. The slaughter of black people, the problem existed for a long time.
The word slaughter was not translated into English for those in the room by the Chinese delegation's interpreter.
Hold on 1 second, please.
Journalists were about to be ushered out when the Secretary of State made it clear his delegation wanted to speak again.
I just made my first trip, as I noted, to Japan and South Korea. I have to tell you, what I'm hearing is very different from what you described. I'm hearing deep satisfaction that the United States is back, that we're re-engaged with our allies and partners. I'm also hearing deep concern about some of the actions your government is taking.
A confident country is able to look hard at its own shortcomings and constantly seek to improve. And that is the secret sauce of America.
Alaska is a midway point, just over 6,000 kilometers to Beijing, just under 6,000 kilometers to Washington, D.C. This was a meeting that was supposed to build bridges. What we've seen here could be a welcome clearing of the air, or perhaps the beginning of a deepening of the division. It all depends on the crucial talks which now continue behind closed doors. James Bays, Al Jazeera, Anchorage.
In the lead up to the meeting, China's neighbors expressed concerns to the U.S. Secretary of State. And Anthony Blinken criticized China's threats to regional security in visits to South Korea and Japan. A week earlier, the U.S., India, Japan, and Australia held a summit of the so-called Quad Group. China's growing influence in the Asia-Pacific region drove much of the discussion. Although the final communique didn't mention Beijing, it did voice support for the rule of law, democracy, and a region unconstrained by coercion. All right, let's bring in our guests. From Washington, D.C., Scott Snyder, Senior Fellow for Korea Studies and Director of the U.S. Korea Policy Program at the Council on Foreign Relations. In Beijing, Melinda Liu, Beijing Bureau Chief for Newsweek. And in Kuala Lumpur is Far Kim Beng, founder of Strategic Pan-Indo-Pacific Arena and former Director of Political and Security Community in the ASEAN Secretariat. Thank you all for joining us. Scott, let me start with you today. This was quite a tense confrontation at the beginning of the meeting between the U.S. and China. How unexpected was that?
I don't know that it was necessarily that unexpected because the Biden administration has spent a week framing its engagements in Asia and towards China with the expectation that there are areas of confrontation, there are areas of cooperation, and that there's going to be an adversarial component to the relationship that will persist from the Trump administration, and that is actually somewhat different from what we saw under Obama the last time that this team was engaged.
Melinda, does the fact that the beginning of these talks was so confrontational, and the fact that that confrontation was actually on camera, that it was made public, does that suggest to you that the discussions behind the scenes will be even more contentious? I mean, can there actually be a reset in the U.S.-China relations at this point?
I'm skeptical about the possibility of a total reset. There are a lot of intractable differences of opinion and disagreements and disputes. However, I kind of think that both sides were, playing a game of one-upmanship and gamesmanship actually for quite a while, even leading up to Anchorage, as well as right before the talk. I mean, clearly the audience for a lot of that maneuvering and circling and, tit-for-tatting at the beginning was the domestic audiences back home, not necessarily each other. I wouldn't be at all surprised if, we have another session of talks. I wouldn't be surprised if at the end of it, they came out kind of okay, and maybe in the coming months there might be some incremental signs of further engagement. I mean, the key thing here is to keep talking. If the whole thing breaks down and there is no more talking, then I think we should all take cover.
Far, from your perspective, what are the biggest hurdles that need to be cleared in trying to improve the diplomatic relationship between the U.S. and China right now?
Well, if I'm allowed to summarize the Sino-U.S. relationship in my own distinct method, I would say that both countries are actually seeking to assert their theater preponderance, in other words, over Indo-Pacific. That's the first T. The second one is both countries are also engaged in trade or tariff war. And then there's also the third component, which is the technology war. China is unlike what we know 20 or 40 years ago. China is actually getting stronger and stronger, even though 1/3 of its semiconductor chips still have to be imported from abroad. The fourth dimension that actually affects the relationship is what I call Tiananmen-like issue. In other words, the struggle over issues touching on Xinjiang, Hong Kong, perhaps even Taiwan or Tibet. In other words, there's a heavy component or element of human rights contention. The next issue would be Taiwan and China conflict, because the Chinese Communist Party was formed in 1921, and this is their centennial. The rhetoric has been increased, and the language of President Xi Jinping has also changed a little bit, in the sense that President Xi Jinping does not completely forsake the possibility of using war to unify with Taiwan. And then lastly, you can say that this is a contention between a totalitarian and open society, the concept of open society with the West or with Japan or South Korea.
Scott, countries in the region have been airing grievances to the U.S. about China. So how do they expect the U.S. to bring this up with China, and what response do they hope that will be coming from Beijing?
Well, I think that the main point here is that they are expecting that the U.S. Is going to stand for the values that it has espoused. I think that the way that Secretary Blinken has addressed it, is concerned about greater repression internally in China and greater aggression externally. And so there's a list of areas of cooperation. One is the broader trade competition that we can see framed through the Quad in terms of, I guess, pandemic diplomacy and provision of vaccines. But I actually think that the most important thing that U.S. allies are looking for is U.S. support to stand against aggressive or unfair trade retaliation or economic retaliation by China. And the most recent focal point for that is really in the China-Australia relationship. So my ears really perked up when I heard Secretary Blinken, focused on that set of issues. The others related to values, I think, are familiar. There are areas of deep disagreement in many cases because China has tried to delineate them as internal issues, but they are definitely part of a deepening values competition between the U.S. and China more broadly.
Melinda, are countries in the region hopeful that a reset in the relationship between the U.S. and China would really work in their favor?
I think each country has to be thinking that. That's in their national interest to think that. I think some of the smaller countries around the periphery of China are concerned about how it's going to play out. There's a profound difference here in terms of how Beijing and Washington each look at this relationship. One side, China, takes a very, very long-term view, whereas in Washington, you can't really predict much more than 4 years ahead of time, which is why we've got this strange and intense disconnect now. Obviously, there had been, once upon a time, there had been some areas of cooperation or potential cooperation between China and America, while having some very, very serious disagreements. What is there to persuade Chinese officials that 4 years from now, come another presidential election in Washington, there might be a whole nother Trump-like turnaround and everything gets upset and has to start all over again? That cannot be ruled out. I'm not saying Trump himself would come back, but the political dynamic that created him has not gone away.
Farah, I saw you nodding along to a lot of what Melinda was saying. Did you want to jump in?
Well, I do want to jump in, and I just want to say that I must compliment Melinda for saying that, because we really cannot expect what will happen in 2024 in terms of American election, presidential or congressional. But then we also have to bear in mind that 2024 is perhaps one of the most crucial year of this decade, because you don't just have a nationwide election in the United States. Aside from the United States, you have another one in India. You have election in Taiwan, presidential election in Taiwan. You also have election in Iran. In Southeast Asia, we have another election, presidential election in Indonesia. And the list goes on and on. So if Biden administration is concerned about defending democracy and shaping its entire Indo-Pacific strategy as a concert of diplomacy, then President Joe Biden and his team, his Indo-China Pacific team, is practically the largest in the National Security Council, will have a lot on its plate.
Scott, where do things stand right now when it comes to the relationship between the U.S. and South Korea, and how does that impact South Korea's relationship with China?
Well, I think that component of Secretary Blinken's travel was very interesting, precisely because China was not mentioned in the public statements, in contrast to the emphasis on China and Japan. And I think that fact illustrates the sensitivity of South Korea's balancing act between the U.S. And China. It probably reflects some differences in terms of preferred instruments and approach. And of course, South Korea also is now sitting outside the Quad, even though it is a robust democracy. And so that also, I think, raises questions that are going to be hashed out, I think, over time. And then, of course, there's the fact that this whole trip was really framed focusing on China, and South Korea's main security preoccupation is the threat from North Korea. And we saw the North Koreans essentially voicing the possibility that it's going to be very difficult to renew a dialogue on denuclearization with North Korea. And so that is going to be a potential irritant. It's an X factor that actually could upend the entire China-focused strategy that the Biden administration has laid out.
Melinda, we've spoken a lot here today about areas of disagreement between the U.S. and China, but I want to speak for a moment about areas of common interest. And I want to cite an article that you wrote just a few days back for Foreign Policy, in which you said that despite all the disagreements between China and the U.S., we could start to see cooperation from both countries on the issue of climate change, and that the relationship between John Kerry, who's the special U.S. presidential envoy for climate, he's also a former Secretary of State, and President Xi Jinping could make a difference there. Why is that?
Well, first of all, these are two people who know each other very well. In fact, we have some very interesting relationships that go back many, many years. The most important one being between President Biden and President Xi, who spent an extraordinary amount of time for that level of Chinese and American officials when each of them was the vice president of their country. And lots of one-on-one conversations. And then, as you mentioned, we have each country now has named a climate envoy. America, for the first time, has elevated this position to be a special presidential envoy. And that is John Kerry, the former Secretary of State, as you mentioned. And in China, it is a senior Chinese climate expert who had been in semi-retirement. He had basically been the architect of China's negotiating stance in the run-up to the Paris Accords. He and his counterpart in the United States, Todd Stern, first had their agreement, which laid the groundwork for the Paris Accords. And Kerry has already recalled that he's known this guy, Xie Zhenhua is his name. They've known each other for 20 years. And so because climate change is a common global problem, I mean, they're sitting there in Alaska where the glaciers are melting at a record rate because of global climate change. There's a possibility for common ground. It might take a while to get to that issue because there's so many other pressing and more urgent issues to discuss. But it's one glimmer of hope in a very tense relationship.
Far, I want to talk for a moment about an issue that concerns the ASEAN countries when it comes to the South China Sea and China's militarization of the seaway. Where do things stand when it comes to that issue right now?
Well, first of all, when anyone wants to understand South China Sea, they should not get all too worked up when all the delegations gather together to have a working group session. When the meeting is at the working group level, even if you have a draft that is rather strong, perhaps with enforcement mechanism, the foreign minister or the president who may not like the language of the draft may walk it or dial it back. And a very simple example being what Wang Yi once said. He said, ideally, he would like to see the South China Sea Code of Conduct being concluded by 2021. And some ASEAN heads of states and foreign ministers were not really sure whether he meant by the end of 2021 or is it to prevent it from going any further. So it takes a lot of diplomatic practice to a large extent to understand what ASEAN really does and how ASEAN uses Western terminology in international relations in a completely different way. Confidence building in ASEAN does not have verify and trust. It's all about information sharing and trust building and networking.
Scott, President Biden has made it clear he wants to return the U.S. to its traditional multilateralism and reconstitute the alliance of the West to present a united front to China. Can that be achieved?
Well, that's the experiment. He's coming back to, or bringing the United States back to kind of the status quo ante in terms of a conception of U.S. international leadership. But as we've already discussed, the world has changed, the U.S. has changed. I think that on this trip, the main purpose in Japan and South Korea was to take the measure of how much allies have changed. And there's an emergence of a new focal point with China, and all of those are potential stress points for testing the viability of that foreign policy vision. So, I think that the framing is there now, and we're going to have to see how it plays out.
Melinda, it looked to me like you wanted to perhaps jump in and add to what Scott was saying. Please go ahead.
Oh, no, I didn't mean to say that. I was just sort of nodding my agreement.
Well, let me ask you this, Melinda. Let me ask you this. Last week's virtual meeting of the Quad, these are the leaders of the U.S., Japan, Australia, and India. How was that perceived by Chinese officials?
Well, the propaganda in China was all that, this attempt to make the Quad a real sort of security group is doomed to fail. They see it as a vehicle for containing China, but a vehicle without many wheels, because it hadn't, let's just say since its inception a number of years ago, it hadn't really got off the ground very assertively. The issue now is that Washington and the Biden administration, are declaring America is back. But you can't just erase what 4 years of almost quasi-isolationism, quixotic foreign policy making, and all that under the Trump administration. In 4 years, China, in its own relentless way, did what it could to take advantage of the default position of the Trump administration, which was, we don't really care about the rest of the world. It's America first. And so the allies, of course, there are some very traditional strong allies in the Pacific. But, when China is right there on your border, or right there, across a small body of water, and America is quite a long ways away, you've got to be wondering, if there were another Trump-like figure on the horizon, where do we want to put our eggs in this basket? We saw it with the EU in terms of trade. In the last days of the Trump administration, China and the EU had made a major trade agreement that was not in step with, the game plan that America would have liked to see.
All right, we've run out of time, so we're going to have to leave the conversation there. Thank you so much to all of our guests, Scott Snyder, Melinda Liu, and Far Kim Beng. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see this and all our previous programs again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. We are at AJ Inside Story. For me, Mohammed Jamjoom, and the whole team here, bye for now.